Righteousness exalts a nation. What makes a nation sikat? Because the women reached Mount Everest? Because we won the Olympics? What? What makes our nation sikat? Righteousness exalts a nation. It's what lifts a nation up. Proverbs 16:32. Watch this verse. He who is slow to anger. How many of you know somebody who's quick to anger? Just walks out of a meeting. Anybody know? It says, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He who rules his spirit. If you can control yourself, you're better than he who takes a city. Okay? Proverbs 29. Move on a little bit to the end. Look at Proverbs 29. Verse 2. Fantastic verse. When the righteous are in authority. Let's put it another way. When Christians are in authority. Let's put it still another way. When the church is in authority, what happens? The people rejoice. But when the wicked man rules, the people groan. Do you know a nation that is groaning? Do you know a nation that wickedness is ruling? Where corruption is a culture? The kind of nation that God had in mind was Israel would be a nation that was based on His word, His worship, and because of that, it would be a nation that was righteous. Are you with me? All right? I'm going to make a statement. Listen to this. The separation of the church and state was never the original plan of God to run the nation. I'll say that again. The separation of the church and the state was not God's original plan to run the nation Israel. In fact, Israel was a nation. It was also the church of God. Israel was the church and Israel was the state. God never gave two sets of laws to say, okay, this is for the church and this is for the state. He never designed God's people to be separated that way. Are you with me? He assigned a people to run the government of Israel. That government was to be run by the priesthood. As the people of Israel looked around them, they noticed, hey, we're the only nation with priests. Everybody else has kings. They have kings there, they have kings here. That nation has kings. The nation behind us has kings. How come we don't have a king? What God was really trying to impart to them was, He is the king. And He had a group of people that were to run His government, and the group was called the priesthood. Israel cried out to God and said, no, give us a king like the nation around us. And of course, eventually, God gave in to that because they did not want to obey His will. And they came into a second best structure wherein a king now ran Israel, but there was also still the priesthood. This is why this is dangerous. Listen to me. Because that's when the separation of the church and the state began. Are you with me? Okay. Once you separate the church and the state, here's the problem. Kings now made their own laws. Kings now felt they were exempted from the laws of the priest. And the priest had the 10 Commandments and other laws given by God, which was supposed to run Israel. But the king said, I'm the king. I want to go inside the temple. And the priest would say, well, you can't come inside the temple. Only priests are allowed to come inside the temple. But I'm the king. And so now kings had more power than the priests. Are you with me? And every king that came on started to make their own rules or their laws. And some of the laws were against God's laws. So now you have the beginning of the separation of the church and the state. And if you trace that through history, till this day, churches are now convinced that the state's affairs and the church's affairs should be two separate things. And that's why when a Christian now runs in politics, Christians will say, what's a Christian doing in politics? Our message to you today is, don't back off. The church, because they believed in the separation of the church and the state, has backed off far too much that we have no right to speak God's laws into man's laws for our nation anymore. What are we going to be? A church that says, okay, let's let the city run their own laws and we'll keep our own laws. Well, that's effectively what has happened through the centuries. Watch this. Sooner or later, when they divided the church and the state, Now the priests did not have authority over all the people. They only had authority over the premises of the church. Are you getting this? And because they only had authority over the premises of the church, the laws inside the church was now different from the laws outside the church. But the devil wasn't content with that. He began to push Israel into a corner. The next thing you know, you see the church can only exercise itself on a Sunday. Think about that. Now that they've clipped the jurisdiction and scope of how much authority a church can have, he now backs up the church into one segment of the week called Sunday. And so the church was a Sunday thing. Church was for Sunday things. And the rest of the week was secular. If you go in that line of thinking, that means you don't have to be a Christian 7 days a week. You can only be a Christian 1 day a week. It's okay. Just follow man's laws 6 days a week. 1 day a week you can follow God's laws. How many of you have ever been like me, been a little bit better on a Sunday than on a Monday? You ever done that? Maybe in a previous religion. How many of you just were a little bit better on a Sunday than the rest of the week? How many of you ever said, La Domingo Rabaron? It's for the Lord. Shouldn't every day be for the Lord? Well, sooner or later, as we were convinced the day of the Lord is Sunday, somebody called it the Lord's Day. So guess what? Monday's not the Lord's Day. Tuesday's not the Lord's Day. Wednesday's not the Lord's Day. There's no Lord on Friday. Since when could we tell God which day he could own and which day he couldn't? Think about that. All right? Sooner or later, it was restricted now to a piece of real estate. You can be you can be who you like the rest of the week, but as soon as you step inside the church, you had to follow the church's laws. The law outside, you can wear whatever you want to wear. But if you come inside the church, you're not allowed to wear sleeveless or spaghetti or tube or V-neck down to your waist or backless or slits. See, there are now a double standard of laws. Are you keeping up? Because I'm just laying a foundation here. Now the church had its own set of rules for Sunday, and it now had a piece of real estate. So you and I could be anything we want the rest of the week, as long as if we stepped in on Sunday, in that premise, we had to obey God's laws. When you separate the church and the state, you put God in a box. That means I can be bad all week, but on Sunday I got to be good. Are you with me? The separation of the church and the state was not a design by God, because now it created a priesthood with a set of laws and a king with a set of laws, and oftentimes they would clash at each other, but because kings had armies, priests were often slaughtered. King Saul did exactly that. Chasing David, he slaughtered the priesthood. I'll say this to you again. The church is the state, and the state is the church, according to God's original design of what Israel should be. Are you with me? So what has happened to the church? It's backed off into a building. It's backed off into a day of the week. It's backed off into an activity called worship service. And the rest of the week, you follow a different set of rules. Kings made laws for the nation, and the church and the priests made laws for the church. I declare to you today, that's not God's will.